Two men whose conviction for the 1965 assassination of Malcolm X was overturned last year will receive a $36 million award, settlement from the city and state of New York. Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam both spent more than 20 years in prison for the murder of the civil rights activist. They always denied wrongdoing and were released in the 1980s, but their names were only cleared last year by the Supreme Court, who called their convictions a failure of justice.
For more on this, we can now cross live to Washington and speak with Arise U.S. correspondent Eric Ham. Eric, good to see you. Please tell us more about these settlements to the two men who were exonerated last year for the 1965 assassination of Malcolm X.
Yeah, this actually finally closes a very dark chapter, not only in New York history, but also American history, where, of course, we know that the iconic former civil rights icon was gunned down in a Harlem ballroom back in 1965. And two of the three men that were actually convicted for that murder had claimed their innocence for decades. And last year, the state of New York finally overturned those convictions, even though both men had been released from prison back in the 1980s. And what we saw is that both men eventually filed a $40 million wrongful suits against the state of New York. And what we saw was finally the state now saying that they are going to award both men a combined $36 million to be split among the two men. Islam, who actually died a few years ago, his estate filed a $40 million suit. But now what we're seeing is that both men will receive this compensation. And the lawyers for one of the men has already has said that this finally marks, the end of a very dark chapter in the history of the nation with this final settlement. Now, of course, there were three men that were actually convicted for the murder of Malcolm X. And one man who was actually convicted says that he was, in fact, guilty of the assassination of Malcolm X, but that the two men who were in fact convicted along with him, he had always claimed that they were innocent of this murder. In addition to that, we know that the state of New York had done an extensive investigation into the assassination of Malcolm X, finding that those two men, Muhammad and Islam, had not been were not actually guilty of the slaying.
Now, another huge story at the moment is, of course, the brutal attack on Paul Pelosi, who is a husband to the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. What's the latest on his condition and, of course, the ongoing police investigation?
Yeah, what we do know is that he is recovering after having gone through brain surgery. We know that he suffered a fractured skull in this attack by this individual who broke into the home of both Paul and Nancy Pelosi, seeking the Speaker of the House. We know now with more details that this individual was armed with a hammer, breaking into a back door of the home. And we're now learning that Paul Pelosi, learning of this break-in, he confronted the intruder and then said that he had to go to the bathroom where his phone was actually charging. When he got to the bathroom, he actually dialed 911. Didn't say anything to the 911 operator, but left the phone open so the 911 operator could hear what was actually taking place. The 911 operator then actually dispatched police officers to the home where they found the two men actually clinched in a back and forth. And now we know that this individual is now in custody for this attack. Now, as a result of this, of course, we have heard calls for a call for trying to tamp down on the ongoing rhetoric that we see taking place on both sides of the aisle, with only 9 days before, of course, millions of Americans go to the polls to determine who will control power of Congress, of both chambers.
That was definitely a horrendous attack. And how has this impacted the upcoming midterm elections?
Well, right now, of course, many are not aware, in fact, what this may mean for the election going forward. But, of course, what we are now seeing is with the brutal attacks, of course, of January 6th, and now this latest attack on the husband of the Speaker of the House, there are growing concerns about violent attacks. And also today in Washington, the Supreme Court will take up the case of affirmative action, where many believe that for the first time, of course, we could see affirmative action overturned. This, of course, could only spur greater political protests and demonstrations, which many believe could lead to greater violence. So right now, there's a growing uncertainty as to how all of this is going to shape or determine the outcome of the elections. But what we're now beginning to see are many calls to try to tamp down on the rhetoric, to try to eliminate further acts of violence.
And still on the midterm elections, we're seeing the Democrats gaining more and more momentum. Do you have any updates on what those numbers are looking like now?
Yeah, we do. In fact, early voting is taking place all across the country right now. And what we're seeing is that the turnout, particularly among Democrats, is at a very high point right now. In fact, we're seeing numbers right now that are not only outpacing the midterm elections of 2018, but also on par with, of course, that historic election of 2020, where Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump. And so what we're seeing now is Democrats have a roughly 2.3 million vote lead over Republicans in early voting, a number that, quite frankly, Democrats did not have in the midterm elections. And so while many see this as being a very tight race to determine control of both chambers of Congress, right now what we're seeing is Democrats are showing that they are very excited to actually turn out to the polls. And just to give you an example of what we're talking about, in the state of Georgia, which many believe could determine the outcome of this race, we are seeing where black men have actually set a record for voter turnout in that state, outpacing even black women who were actually seen as the crucial turning point for Democrats, both in 2018 and 2020. So an election, of course, like none other that we have seen in this country in decades.
Now, Eric, I just want to go back to, the attack on Paul Pelosi. There has been different, speculation regarding the motive. We even saw a tweet from Elon Musk. Has there been an established motive at this point?
That's I'm glad that you brought that up. There has been these conspiracy theories on the right that have suggested that this was not a political attack, but this was an attack by, we won't even go into, this was an attack by Paul Pelosi's lover, and the police department have ruled that out. This is actually an individual who was also at the January 6th insurrection. He used much of the same language on the attack of Paul Pelosi that we saw at the January 6th insurrection that took place in 2021. And so the police have debunked any of these outlandish theories that have been bandied about, particularly as what we have seen from the new owner of Twitter, Elon Musk.
All right, Eric Ham, thank you so much for giving us that insight from across the Atlantic.